Good morning. We begin by acknowledging country. We are gathered here, as always, on Darug country, in Parramatta, the place of eels. We pay our respects to Darug elders, to First Law, and to all knowledge and story caretakers of this country. To remember together today, these lands were never ceded. These lands were, are, and will always be Aboriginal. And I'd like to also welcome and acknowledge colleagues and guests, First Nations colleagues and guests here with us today, and especially Likan and Thai friends from Toconao in northern Chile who are visiting the university today, and they will be doing a seminar at 2 o'clock in room EBG02. My name is Juan Salazar. I'm a professor here at Western Sydney, and I'm delighted to have been invited to chair this very important session today, and I'll introduce our distinguished speakers in a minute. Some housekeeping: there's lunch being served at the back of the ICS in building EM after this. There's a filming going on. The filming will not affect anyone sitting behind the camera, but just to let you know, there's a film being recorded and made. And after the presentations, the three presentations, there will be a time for a Q&A. So please use the microphone to record the questions for camera. Today is a very important day, long due, and the seminar is titled Taking Action for Palestine in Academic and Cultural Institutions. The genocide in Gaza, the ecocide in Gaza, the epistemicide in Gaza is ongoing, a relentless war machine out of control, sustained by centuries-old infrastructures of Western colonialism and collusion. During 117-year-old violent, settler, colonial and illegal occupation of Palestine, of Palestinian people, of Palestinian culture, and their connection to lands, waters, and skies. A war that, in the humiliation and dehumanization of Palestinian lives, has become other than human, guided by AI technology, gospel, lavender, coresight. But also during this ongoing genocide, we once again bear witness to the resistance and courage of Palestinian people and hold them in their dreams and hopes for freedom. Many have spoken around the world, spoken about and spoken up, from Colombian President Gustavo Petro to Professor Alana Lentin, that Zionism is the fight of the century. And as Alana has written and spoken in many venues, it is not only a fight to free Palestine, it is a fight to free us all from the 500-year-old idea that racial colonial domination by the minority over the global majority is justified in the name of Western civilization. I would like to pay my deepest respects to Alana Lentin, colleague from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts, for the amazing, restless work she has been doing for the past 6 months. So thank you, Alana, for all the work you've been doing. And just one more thing, if you allow me, please bear with me a little indulgence. I would like to read a very short poem by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. I come from there and I have memories, born as mortals are. I have a mother and a house with many windows. I have brothers, friends, and a prison cell with a cold window. Mine is the wave, not snatched by seagulls. I have my own view and an extra blade of grass. Mine is the moon at the far edge of the words, and the bounty of birds, and the immortal olive tree. I walked this land before the swords, turned its living body into a laden table. I come from there. I render the sky unto her mother, when the sky weeps for her mother, and I weep to make myself known to a returning cloud. I learned all the words worthy of the cord of blood, so that I could break the rule. I learned all the words and broke them up to make a single word, homeland. We are very, very honored today at the ICS seminar to host 3 distinguished speakers. Ronit Lentin is a retired associate professor of sociology, Trinity College, Dublin, currently living on unceded Gadigal land. Her main works include Thinking Palestine from 2008, Traces of Racial Exception, Racializing Israeli Settler Colonialism, 2018, and Enforcing Silence, Academic Freedom, Palestine and the Criticism of Israel, 2020. And today Ronit will discuss the historical and present-day involvement of Israeli academia in upholding the colonization of Palestine. Welcome, Ronit. Amani, Amani Haydar is an author, visual artist, and advocate for women's health and safety based on Dargland. Her groundbreaking memoir, The Mother Wound, published in 2021, has received several awards, including the 2022 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Nonfiction. And today Amani will look at the link between interpersonal abuses and state-sanctioned abuses within feminist spaces, particularly those focused on interpersonal violence. Welcome, Amani. And then Alana Lentin is a Jewish anti-Zionist European woman who is a settler on Gadigal Wangal land. She's a professor of cultural and social analysis here at Western Sydney University, and her work focuses on the critical theorization of race, racism, and anti-racism. Her latest books is Why Race Still Matters, published in 2020, and Alana today will present on the current repression of anti-Zionist voices within academic institutions in several key locations, with a focus on the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism as a mechanism of colonial silencing. Ronit, the floor is yours. Yeah, wherever you like. Okay, yeah. I don't need to sit here with you.
So thank you very, very much for inviting me to speak here today. Can you hear me without a microphone? Yeah? No?
Like, and
yes?
Especially for the camera, maybe? No?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really honored. This talk is based on a chapter I did for the book on enforcing silence, which is basically about academic freedom and the boycott of the academic boycott of Israel. Last month, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem suspended Professor Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian of the Faculty of Law and Institute of Criminology for denouncing the Gaza genocide and casting doubts on the Hamas rape allegations. University justified the suspension by saying it would preserve a safe climate on campus. Shalhoub-Kevorkian is a well-known, world-renowned Palestinian feminist scholar and author of many books, and her research focuses on trauma, state crime, surveillance, gender violence, law and society. She said in a recent podcast that she would never allow anyone to touch a baby, kidnap a child, or rape a woman. Not in my name, she said. I would never accept it as a Palestinian. In fact, she's been in trouble before. After a paper she gave in 2019, claiming that Israel tests weapons on Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian children to boost its international arms sales, the Minister for Education called for her dismissal. And last October, the university pressured her to resign her job when she signed a call for immediate ceasefire. According to Gurminder Bambra and her colleagues, Western universities are key sites through which colonialism, colonial knowledge, and theories of racism have been produced, institutionalized, and naturalized. and universities in the global north were founded and financed through the spoils of colonial plunder, enslavement, and dispossession. As an imperialist, colonial, race-making European project, Zionism has always relied on academic knowledge to deepen its hold on Palestine and racialize the Palestinians. Since the early days of the Zionist movement, Jewish universities in Palestine were used as a state-building instrument and were key to enabling the colonization of Palestine and the racialization of the Palestinians. In fact, university education in Israel and occupied Palestine takes place in areas from which Palestinians have been expelled. Thus, the Ben Gurion University in the Nakab is located in Beersheba, which is a renamed Palestinian city of Beersheba, which was occupied by the Zionists in October 1948. 5,000 Palestinians were driven out at gunpoint to Hebron, and some of them were shot. Tel Aviv University stands on the ground of the depopulated Palestinian village Sheikh Muanis, one of whose houses is the faculty club to this day. The Hebrew University's Mount Scopus campus is on occupied Palestinian land, occupied in 1967. The university benefits from settlement infrastructure, transport lines, and access roads, most of them built on privately owned Palestinian land. And most infamously, Ariel University is built on the illegal Israeli colony settlement Ariel in the occupied West Bank. Now, there are various historical and current aspects of the Israeli Academy's complicity with the colonization of Palestine. According to the Israeli sociologist Uri Ram, Israeli universities were always central to Zionism's statist approach, and Zionist academics have always maintained white European Jewish supremacy and produced various policies of colonization, of the racialization of Palestinians, and as racially inferior to Israeli Jews, of Jewish immigration, of forging Jewish identity as opposed to so-called Israeli Arab identity, of the 1948 to 1966 military government regime, and of Zionist land ownership. Since the 1967 occupation, academics have been more central to policies of colonization and settlement, segregation and apartheid, domination and military prowess, and I'll give examples later. According to the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which is acronymed as PACB, the current Gaza genocide, in which more than 40,000, perhaps even 50,000 in figures I read yesterday, were murdered, and 80% of Gaza has been rendered inhabitable, has elicited the support of most Israeli universities. Some of them came out with statements supporting the fighting, and they offer faculty and student reserve soldiers who are actively involved in the killing field of Gaza various perks and privileges as rewards for their contribution to the war effort, the so-called state security. This discriminates, of course, against Palestinian students, most of whom are not recruited to the IDF, and thus not eligible for university grants and deferred exam dates available to serving Israeli student soldiers. Israeli academics are no different from the rest of Israeli society, Jewish society, where 95% justify the bloody assault on the Palestinian people in Gaza, according to a recent poll. The complicity of the Israeli Academy is evidenced in several ways. Israeli universities and third-level institutions of science and technology are central to developing and manufacturing Israel's weapons and security systems, training military security personnel, and providing theoretical backing to the Israeli occupation. At the same time, Israel exercised control and surveillance over academics, academic institutions, and students in occupied Palestine, curtailing students and academics' freedom of movement and the actual freedom to educate Palestinians at all levels. Having successfully recruited Israeli academics as active collaborators in the colonization of Palestine, Israel stymized free debate on the Israeli colonization of Palestine. So what I'll do, I'll highlight some of the importance of the academic boycott of Israeli institutions, and I want to debunk the belief that Israeli academics are actually liberal and radical, and therefore should not be boycotted. So let's start first with the University Party developing armament system. The Israeli anthropologist Jeff Halper argues that Israel transforms its military and securocratic prowess into political clout in pursuing what he called the security politics. As argued by the Australian journalist Anthony Lorenstein, the occupied Palestinian territory serves as a testing ground for the development of weapons, tactics, security systems, and models of population control, without which Israel would not be able to compete in international arms and security markets. Israel's weapons and security industries could not succeed without the active collaboration by academics and universities. One wonders whether the recently disclosed AI program Lavender, which targets Palestinian operatives but bombs them in their homes, killing whole families, was developed in collaboration with Israeli academics. Israeli academia also provides training for the arms industry, training thousands of engineers and science students in the security systems R&D centers. Later, the return to the civilian market, consolidating the capitalist links between the universities and the security industries. Academics also provide theoretical grounding for new IDF warfare modes. Thus, the Israeli forensic architect Eyal Weizman quotes Tel Aviv University professor of philosophy and also retired IDF Brigadier General Shimon Naveh, who was instrumental in designing the IDF swarming mode of urban warfare. This is a non-linear, polycentric strategy developed for the US Army and a central component of the IDF attacks on refugee camps in densely populated urban areas in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. In Yotam Feldman's film, The Lab, Naveh boasts of having designed a phantom city in the south of the country where the IDF practices urban warfare. Some Israeli universities are more directly involved with the occupation. Like Ariel University is party to Israel's highly lucrative arms and security industries through partnering with the weapons manufacturer Israel Aerospace Industries in joint research employing nanotechnology to develop miniature satellites. Secondly, all Israeli higher education institutes provide training programs for military and security personnel. On the lowest level, the Israel College for Security and Investigation prepares graduates to work in Israel's multifaceted, privately run security industry. You'll see the security people anywhere from supermarket to hospitals, anywhere else. More prestigious institutions, such as the flagship Command and Staff College, which provides military and academic training programs in several Israeli universities, enjoy close relationship with Israel's Security and Secret Service Agency. One example is the Hebrew University's Chabatzalot program for military intelligence officers, for which the IDF constructed a highly secured military installation on campus, with the military developing surveillance technologies that affects everyone on campus, where hundreds of uniformed and armed soldiers in departments of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, political science, and philosophy receive preferential treatment, and where high-ranking uniformed officers attend classes and affect their contents. And this turns the part of the campus into a military base. Thirdly, Israeli universities play an active role in forming occupation policies. One notorious example is the Haifa University professor of demography and geostrategy Arnon Sofer, who authored policies regarding the West Bank separation wall, the Palestinian right of return, and Israel's demographic problem, which is a euphemism for the high birth rate amongst the Palestinians. So first, my comments on Gaza in 2004, and this is particularly sinister when you think of it today. He says, we will tell the Palestinians that if a single missile is fired over the fence, we will fire 10 in response. And women and children will be killed, and houses will be destroyed. It's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will be even bigger animals than they are today, with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. Fourth, Israel controls Palestinian higher education by regularly raiding and shutting Palestinian universities and colleges in the West Bank and bombing educational institutions in Gaza, and by setting limits to the academic freedom of individual academics within the State of Israel, where Palestinian students face many barriers to accessing university education. These barriers include low proficiency in English and Hebrew, insufficient preparation for university exit exams, accessibility, economic difficulties, and also their relatively young age in compared to Israeli students who go to university only their army service. They're barred from many government posts and from taking courses such as geography for so-called security reasons. Therefore, they tend to study medicine and nursing, pharmacy, natural sciences, and engineering. But interestingly, despite the fact that they have barriers, they do very well in these courses. And in fact, the pharmacy profession in Israel is almost entirely staffed by Palestinian people. In addition, politically active Palestinian students in Israeli university are often harassed. According to a 24-year-old law student called Riham Nasra, this can end in suspension, probation, or even expulsion. They think that if the person harasses us, it'll be a greater deterrent. In the occupied West Bank, the Israeli military routinely raids and closes down Palestinian higher education institutes and attacks school and university students. These raids were intensified since the onset of the Gaza genocide. Since October 7, at least 400 Palestinians, including 100 children, have been killed, and more than 7,000 adults have been detained by the Israeli army. And Birzeit University has been regularly attacked and students have been shot. In addition to attacks on the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, which has been defunded by many Western states, Israel has been trying to replace the UNRWA-run schools in occupied East Jerusalem and force them to teach the Israeli curriculum, thus basically eroding Palestinian educational autonomy, further extending Israeli colonial control. Equally damaging is the Israeli policy of imposing entry and residency visas or restrictions on international academics who teach in Palestinian universities. According to the Palestinian Ministry for Education, over half of all foreign staffs in 8 universities have been affected. And this causes serious disruption to the academic programs. Israel's colonial control of Palestinian academic institutions has peaked during the Gaza genocide in the massive destruction of universities, medical and engineering laboratories, training courtrooms in faculties of law, assembly and graduation hall, cultural heritage sites, libraries, archives, and museums. This has been theorized by Professor Carmen Abulsi of Oxford University as scholasticide. Since October 7th, Israel has bombed and destroyed Gaza's 12 universities and some almost 400 schools. And the Palestinian Ministry for Education has reported that some 4,300 students, about 230 teachers, and 95 professors and deans were killed. Targeting Gaza's Palestinian intellectual elites aims to destroy Palestine's futures, and this is in line with settler colonialism goal of eliminating the natives, as argued by Patrick Wolf. But this is not new. The same logic was exercised in 1948. in the Nakba, when thousands of Palestinian books, manuscripts, libraries, archives, photographs, cultural artifacts, and cultural properties were looted, destroyed, and damaged by Zionist militants, while Palestinian schools were destroyed and reappropriated for use by the Israeli state. Besides the Israeli academic complicity with the colonization of Palestine and Israel's control over the Palestinian higher education sector, Israeli academics also collude in the silencing of criticism of Israel's policies of apartheid, colonization, occupation, and genocide. This is, of course, intensified in the October 7th Hamas act of resistance, after which many liberal Zionists have been refusing to admit that what Israel is doing is genocide, citing the Hamas attack as the greater of all evils, upholding Zionism's twin building blocks, Jewish victimhood and white Jewish racial supremacy. Now, following an international campaign, Professor Shalhoub Kevorkian has been actually reinstated by the Hebrew University, who claims that she had clarified her initial statement. In fact, what she said was exactly what she said before, but they sold it at that. In a move typical of the continuing collusion of Israeli academics in the colonization of Palestine, the university's political scientists El Azhar and Podolsky criticized the university for dismissing or suspending Shalhoub Kevorkian and academic freedom, but they did not criticize the genocide in Gaza. And I've just learned yesterday that a colleague called Anat Matar, who is a philosopher in Tel Aviv University, has been ostracized by the university for eulogizing the Palestinian prisoners Walid Daka, who died in prison. Anat is a relentless fighter for Palestinian rights, and of course there will be a campaign to restore her, but she's been, the Minister for Education is calling for her dismissal. So I want to conclude by highlighting the importance of the academic boycott of Israel to the overall struggle to decolonize Palestine. Some people argue that Israeli universities are a haven of free inquiry and liberal dissent, that the academic boycott is unfair since it targets all Israeli academics, even though it is institutional rather than individual. However, the boycott is a tactic, not a principle. It can do Israeli academics no actual harm. Remember, all Israeli academics, very few of whom are critical of their states, actually benefit from the colonization of Palestine through, for instance, access to European Union funding and other research funding, and through their advantageous position at the university by comparison to their Palestinian counterparts. According to a recent book published by Maya Wind, most liberal Israeli academics have joined their right-wing colleagues in opposing PACB's academic boycott campaign and have actually formed counter-campaigns, which is funded by Israel and who the states ought to provide people with talking points, intent on naming all critique as anti-Semitic. And I know Alana will talk more about this. The refrain is always the same. Injustices committed against Palestinians may or may not exist, but if they do, nothing to do with us. And I know I've just mentioned it to a colleague here that in Ireland, the Academics for Palestine, which is a group of Palestinians working on the boycott, have sent a letter to all the university managements asking them to come out with a letter supporting Palestine and denouncing the genocide in Gaza. In fact, one university, the University of Galway, has already done so. So I think this is something which people here might think about. The Gaza genocide renders Israeli academic demurring absurd, and I urge you to join in the academic boycott. This is not against individual Israeli academics, it's against institutions. So what we need to do is support Palestinian academics, students, and universities, both in Palestine and anywhere else, including Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I just want to quickly acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people in the room with us. I really appreciate being invited to be part of this, Alana. I speak from the perspective of someone who has been affected by Israeli violence. I'm going to share my story and I might read a couple of sections from my book. And I work in the gender-based violence space, so I make a lot of connections between interpersonal abuse and the tactics that coercive controllers use, for example, to control an individual, and connect those strategies and tactics with the types of tactics that we see on the state-sanctioned violence level, the kinds of violence that are perpetrated by governments often reflect and also inform the types of violence that individuals commit against others. What brought me to this space? When I was 17, I went to Lebanon and I visited my grandmother. My family are from a village called Haydar, right on the border, which is actually the blue line. My parents experienced Israeli occupation while they were growing up. They had their education and career opportunities disrupted because of that. The villages just south of Aytaron are all over the blue line and were depopulated very violently in 1948. I learnt about these things very cumulatively, picking them up as a young person and then later reading about them and then writing about them. What struck me when I was there as a high school student, I was about to sit my HSC, was the powerful connection that people felt to the land and their insistence on surviving and growing and rebuilding every time that they'd been affected by Israeli occupation or aggression. What also struck me was that that remained a looming threat. There are regular violations of the airspace, there are regular incursions. You can see the surveillance towers from some villages peeping in to the towns. 6 months later, I was back in Australia and I was preparing for my exams, and the 2006 July war broke out in the south of Lebanon. And unfortunately, my grandmother was killed in an incident where a convoy of civilian vehicles fleeing and evacuating on instructions, mind you, from the occupation forces, they were followed and targeted. And the 3 cars were attacked, and the people who managed to get out of the cars were then attacked while they were on foot. The youngest person who died in that incident was a 1-year-old baby girl. There was then an investigation by Human Rights Watch where they went and interviewed the survivors of that incident, including my mum's brother, who described what happened, how they were set upon, how they were followed, and the fact that he could not understand or rationalise why they'd been attacked, despite the fact that they draped their cars in white flags, despite the fact that they'd followed instructions to leave, despite the fact that they had done all of these things to signal that there were no combatants or resistance fighters among them. It was a very difficult thing to process. We actually found out through the news. So my mum was watching Al Jazeera and a news report came on where my grandmother was specifically named along with what town she was from, and she knew it was her mum because nobody else shared her surname. There was no one left alive in our village with that name. It was very difficult because it was the first time I'd experienced the death of someone who was quite close to me and someone who I'd gotten to know so well. And it was also very difficult to witness the way in which the media was really interested in my mum's story of grief, but not in the politics that sat behind that story, not in the question of why are civilians able to be targeted in this way with no accountability, why has this gone on for so long, etc. I observed all of that as a young person. I'm going to read a little section. So later that year, I'm going to read a little section of my book, which will sort of describe how my mum handled these events. But later that year, there was a memorial held, and that's what I'm going to describe now. That October, only days before my final exams, a large multi-denominational service was held at Sydney Town Hall for the victims of the war. Ahead of the event, Mum gave an interview to Elizabeth Jackson and Jennifer Macy on ABC's AM radio show, alongside Professor Ghassan Haj, who was the chairman of the Friends of Lebanon, Australia. I remember listening to the interview on the way to school. They ran on foot, this is my mum's words, they ran on foot into the lemon grove to hide between the trees. So it was my father, my brother, his wife and his daughter, and my mother. So they got bombed a few times, which one of them killed my mother. Professor Haj explained that the intent behind the service. Professor Haj explained the intent behind the service, his words echoing the ways in which, as a teenager at school with very few Lebanese students, in a family where other griefs were much bigger than my own, I had experienced the war in a private and lonely way. And so there were lots of funerals happening, but they were all private. It became quite obvious in some ways that other Australians should know that their fellow Lebanese Australians were suffering on a massive scale as a result of this. Two things struck me when I found a recording of the interview online as I was writing this book. The first is that Mum was only 37 when Dada's life was taken, a few years older than I am now. The second is that as a teenager, I hadn't appreciated the strength it must have taken for Mum to speak her mother's story so soon after losing her. Despite the devastating content, this artifact, this treasure, gave me a way to relate to Mum in a way I'd never related to her before. And the reason I wrote that is because in another really formative act of violence affected my family in 2015 when my mum was murdered in an act of domestic violence by my dad. And in the wake of that murder, someone in a newsroom somewhere connected the two stories. And I remember laying in bed and trying to rest in the days after the murder and scrolling through Facebook and seeing the photos from 2006 pop up in my feed, and then finding myself contemplating the ways in which violence had affected the women in my family intergenerationally. I was 5 months pregnant at the time with my first child, so then that prompted a whole new chain of thoughts around what my role would be as a mother, how long would I live as a mother, how would I heal from this violence and raise children in a world that had now been proven time and time again to be extremely hostile to people like me. The interview contains a sentence that I'm going to read, and it's from my mum. And if you actually listen to the audio of my memoir, The Mother Wound, I managed to get the recording itself, and Mum's voice is on there, extracted into the audio book, which I'm really proud of, and it costs a lot of money. So she said, listening to the interview as an adult, I encounter Mum in a similar phase of her life as I am now, telling a similar story. My mum didn't deserve to die this way. I would never have imagined that she would die this way. And we're still in shock until now. And we have to live with this memory for the rest of our lives. When I wrote this and started thinking about these themes, I knew that all of my advocacy that I was doing in the gender-based violence space would have to connect to the bigger picture. And there are people that I speak to who either struggle to make that leap or don't want to, because the landscape that we're working in prefers to really silo off issues. The funding landscape in women's health and safety spaces is set up in such a way that those connections are actually really unhelpful. You focus on the work that you're doing, and if you make too many connections, you might be at risk of losing your funding, or you can't afford to make those connections in the first place. But with the lived experience that I bring to my work, I had no choice but to tell those two stories concurrently. And for me, that's become really important and a foundational aspect of my feminism. So over the past few months, I've been speaking to a lot of people, and we've been trying to redeploy our resources and use the literacy that we've built in feminist spaces in relation to gender-based violence, in relation to domestic violence-related homicides, to help frame and contextualize violence against Palestinians in Gaza. For us, for people in my community, the continuum is incredibly clear. But I have noticed that we do need to be articulating in a very clear manner. Not necessarily just to explain something that might feel self-evident to us, but to equip workers who are allies to feel confident in their workplaces, bringing these issues up and asking the workplaces that they are part of, which are quite powerful. The women's health and safety space now has pretty influential organisations in it, and many of them regularly meet and interact with ministers and members of parliament. So how do we equip these people who are having these interactions and who are able to wield some sort of power to speak about Palestine and to speak about Palestinian women and children meaningfully within the context of the work that they do? So one of the things that I tried initially was just to reach out to some of the managers that I'd worked with in the past, some of the sector leaders that I'd worked with in the past. And this was immediately after October 7. And I thought, okay, well, they already know my story. I've been talking about this for a long time. They may have already read my book, etc. Of course, they'll get where I'm coming from. But unfortunately, the resistance that I encountered when I asked for that solidarity to be expressed unequivocally, when I asked for that solidarity to be expressed in the terms that Palestinian women themselves wanted it to be expressed, I was quite disappointed. I felt that there was a disconnect between the stories that I had been telling and what people were actually prepared to do in the moment as we braced ourselves for what was going to be inevitable, or preventable rather, I don't even like using the word inevitable in this context, preventable violence against women and children, a preventable refugee crisis, a preventable humanitarian crisis, and anyone in any social justice space should be able to mobilise whatever resources they have and whatever knowledge they have to prevent that kind of violence. So then I thought, okay, how do we do this differently? We do our own statement. Why don't we write a statement articulating the issues, articulating that long history and connecting those dots for others so that the resources can be made available and so that whoever wants to sign as an individual can do so without feeling pressured to name their organisation, for example, if they didn't want to. And that's how we put together the Feminists for a Free Palestine statement. I don't know if anyone in the room has seen it, but it received a lot of support from some key figures, including Grace Tame, including Yumi, who's the manager at the Older Women's Network, including some managers from the various women's health services. That was pretty powerful, and a lot of people felt privileged to be included in that. So there is a hunger for these connections to be made, but institutionally, there's not been much space for that. Another thing that we did was start preparing resources throughout the 16 days of activism last year, which would have been in November, connecting intersecting issues with what was happening in Gaza. And that included things that related to disability justice, things that related to high rates of incarceration amongst the Palestinian population, connecting that to the rates of incarceration here that we talk about all the time as being a problem and not a very effective response to gender-based violence. People then started to articulate as well the connection between high levels of surveillance, the threat of force, the actual use of force, the desire for domination and control over one's family with these broader concepts about how states exercise coercive control over populations, the silencing. All of this language translates very neatly across these two movements, and I think now we're seeing a lot more momentum as a result of this work. So there's a group called Gender-Based Violence Workers for Palestine who have started organising, who are using whatever resources are out there to equip workers to respond in their workplaces, respond within their circles of influence. And just last week we held a teach-in with Randa Abdel Fattah and myself where we spoke and made some of these connections for our audience. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I think, about the potential for people to begin mobilising in whatever space that they are in. I'm quite interested to see how people will use the influence that feminist organisations have managed to build over the past 10 or 15 years in order to shape things like foreign policy in the future, to shape things like what types of relationships are we prepared to have with certain industries, what types of relationships are we prepared to have with certain ministers, how are we going to navigate risks to funding, how are we going to become self-sufficient so that not everything depends on funding. They're the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in. And I guess the little anecdote that I want to leave with everyone was one of the first times I was invited to speak about my experiences. It was at the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, who are based in Melbourne. They held an event which was about, I think it was for International Women's Day or another key date in the feminist calendar. And I told my story. I told my mum's story and I told my grandmother's story, and I spoke about how I had been affected psychologically, physically, practically, economically, in all these different ways by the violence that we'd experienced and the systemic abuses that flow from that, and how victims of crime are impacted by the legal system, the consequences of not feeling heard or validated. And afterwards, just as I was about to leave the spot where I'd been speaking and have a snack, I guess, at the back of the room, I was approached by someone who still, despite that storytelling, said to me, "Why did you have to bring up Israel? That was triggering for me." Mm-hmm. And I couldn't really begin to formulate a response in that moment, especially in the real emotional aftermath of having just spoken and disclosed about your experiences. It's very difficult to then switch and go back on the defensive. And I remember saying something to her about, okay, well, this is about human rights and we're talking about intergenerational trauma. It's connected. And afterwards I went down to the Museum of Immigration, I think it's called, and there was a Khalil Gibran exhibition on at the time, and I was by myself and I had time to decompress. And I told this story in the book. The room was painted this really warm magenta, and it was enough to sort of make you sleepy. And it wasn't until my thoughts slowed down that I was able to formulate a sort of response to this woman. And it was more of a question. It was, why are you comfortable with my story when my dad is the perpetrator, and uncomfortable with my story when the state is the perpetrator? Mm. And that's the sort of question that I go back to in all of my work now. So thank you for listening. I hope that sort of helps make sense of the work that I'm trying to do, and connect dots for others in the same way that I've been connecting them for myself. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amani, for sharing that with us, and I feel very privileged to be sitting here and to have listened to you. And I'd like to start, obviously, by acknowledging the Barra-Madigal people and paying respect to elders past and present. But I'd also like to set that in context of the asymmetry on this panel, which I think is very relevant to the talk that we're having today, and particularly your last point about state violence and the tendency to divert into the terrain of the interpersonal, which is written all over the politics of what we are discussing today. So we are two people who are born on occupied Palestinian land, who have benefited from Zionist white supremacy and settler colonialism, and we are all people who, for one reason or another, have moved and become settlers on occupied Aboriginal land. And I think the relative power that's given to 2 out of 3 of us as settlers within this settler colony, which is a key ally to Israel, not because of some influence of a Zionist lobby pulling puppet strings, as the memes often show it, but because both of them as states are integral to the current functioning of the imperialist system is just important to note. So what I'm going to do, and I really literally scribbled these notes down yesterday, so you have to allow me to apologize if they're less well formulated than my two co-panelists. What I want to do is talk about three things, and I'm going to try and do it briefly so that we have time for questions. So firstly, just a little bit, which I'm sure you're aware of, in terms of an overview of repression on speech and action on Palestine in universities, kind of globally. And then I want to talk about something that I'm writing about at the moment, which is the nexus between the so-called war on critical race theory, which is now segued into looking at diversity, equality, and inclusion, and the flip side of that, which is the usage of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, to constrain speech and to implement the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. And then I'm going to end with some examples from our context, both locally at this university and in Australia, and in particular sound some warning signs about the use of the language of safety, which I think we've heard a lot in the last 6 months, but it's definitely not new. Okay, so as you all know, since October the 7th, the level of repression of speech and activism on Palestine at universities across the global north has reached unprecedented levels, although it's not new. So, you know, some examples, particularly from the US, but definitely not only, you've seen staff being fired and sanctioned in various ways. It's important to note that this is particularly targeted casual or adjunct staff, so people who don't have a high profile, who are already in a precarious position vis-a-vis the university. It's been much easier to move those people on, and there have been notable silences from tenured academics in the face of this, dismissal and sanctioning of their colleagues. Students have also been dismissed. You may have seen recent cases at Columbia where students were literally told to leave their dorm rooms. And student organizations, like, for example, in the US, Students for Justice in Palestine, have been banned, but also Jewish anti-Zionist student organizations have been banned along with them at several key universities in the United States. You've also seen students and staff being doxxed with, these crazy vans roaming around with people's information emblazoned on them on screens. And kind of less high profile, and this is the continuity with what has been par for the course really for decades, is pressure being put on university administrators behind the scenes to fire and sanction staff and clamp down on academic speech on Palestine. So, for example, I am a member of the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which was established towards the end of last year. And we held our inaugural conference in New York and Santa Cruz last October. Strangely, it was on the day, the first day, the day I spoke, was on the day of the Voice to Parliament referendum, so 1 week after October the 7th. It was a very strange moment. But that conference was virulently attacked by Zionist lobby groups, leading to one venue cancelling, so not permitting the conference to take place, and huge amount of pressure put on the academics who were organizing the conference to basically not hold it, but luckily it went ahead nonetheless. And this is becoming a very important network of scholars and activists who are engaging in the critical study of Zionism. So if people are interested in that, I'm definitely happy to talk more about that later on. Germany is a particularly interesting case, as I'm sure you all noted. Perhaps you've been following the ICJ this week in Nicaragua's case against Germany. And we've seen several high-profile cancellations of both academics, including Ghassan Haj, who was mentioned earlier, and Nancy Fraser more recently. Artists like the Jewish South African artist Candice Brides also, who's had her exhibition cancelled. But it's really important to note that the repression, again in Germany, of both activism but also of students and staff has really targeted much less high-profile people. So in the kind of cases that we get to know about, these are people who don't actually have that much to lose, like they're not going to lose their job, but people who are working within German academia have a lot at stake, but more significantly you have mass repression of Palestinian, and it's important to note that Germany has the highest population of Palestinians living there, just as a matter of course, including my friend and colleague Dr. Anna Esther Yunus, who has theorized what she calls the war on anti-Semitism, has been blacklisted in Germany and currently has a case going through the German courts because of the level of repression of her academic freedom. I could say a lot more on that, but I just wanted to set the scene, and I think people are probably aware. So it's important to note that in the context of the war on kind of critical inquiry on race and racism, which has been referred to as the war on critical race theory, that I've been struggling to write about for the last few years, that Palestine is actually a central focus. And a couple of examples on that, which again are not new. For example, going back to 2016, you have efforts by Zionist lobby groups in California, this is just one example, against the movement to establish Californian legislation that would make the teaching of ethnic studies mandatory in high school. And one of the organizations that's been involved in that is an organization called the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. And Zionist lobby groups such as the Amcha Initiative, but they're definitely not the only ones, have been attacking this in the courts for many years, as I say, going back to 2016, leading to any kind of content on Palestine that was included in the curriculum having to be omitted from the curriculum so that no students in schools or universities would be able to talk about Palestine, even though obviously the entire curriculum is designed around the struggles for liberation of colonized peoples around the globe, with lots of different examples, and Palestine, being the longest occupation in recent times and such an important, such an important case. It would seem absolutely obvious that this would be included. Now, these same groups used October the 7th as an opportunity, really, to step up their campaign to place what they called guardrails around what could and could not be taught. So it wasn't enough for them to get rid of any mention of Palestine from the curriculum, but they also wanted to write in what they're calling these guardrails that would ensure that no future iteration of the curriculum could include any kind of mention of Palestine. And using October the 7th, the Amcha Initiative accused the University of California Faculty Council of Ethnic Studies of developing, and I quote, material that provides a one-sided, biased, and hateful narrative about Israel and Jews, laden with anti-Zionism that will incite anti-Semitic animus and behavior towards Jewish students. And just to remind you, what we're talking about is just any mention of Palestine within a curriculum of study for students. You've probably also heard of the case of Harvard University, which led to the dismissal of its first black president, Claudine Gay. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because of the use of the language of DEI to attack Claudine Gay. So you have this kind of nexus between Zionist lobbying around repression of Palestine and also attacks that center on, so anti-black attacks that center on the scholarship and intellectual capacity of black scholars, the implication being that they've only been put in place because, it's kind of playing the race card and giving a job to a black woman because of political correctness and so on. So Claudine Gay and other black people are presented as having been hired due to university administration's obsession with DEI. And the right uses discourses of colorblindness to propose that DEI creates bias against white students and faculty. And this same argument is being used by Zionists in order to make similar arguments that now anybody who is, and of course this is exactly what's happening, the connection is made between being Jewish and being Zionist. The two are collapsed together with no recognition of the fact that anti-Zionist Jews exist, that any kind of use of DEI, which they already see as being pro-Palestine, will lead to the silencing of Jewish students and staff, aka Zionists, on campus. An example is a fellow called David Bernstein. He's actually, he's founded this organization called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values in 2021. And this is purportedly to build a strong counter-movement to oppose critical social justice within the Jewish community in the United States. So what we can see here is the collusion between Zionist groups and ultra-conservative white supremacist forces. This could be seen recently in the suspension of my friend and colleague Jairo Funes, who's an assistant professor at Texas Tech University, for his social media posts on Palestine. So Texas Tech suspended Funes after pressure that they received from an organization called Texas Scorecard, which is ultra-conservative, right-wing, white supremacist lobby group with close ties to the university. Funes was basically accused by administrators of anti-Semitism in the classroom for social media posts. So obviously a connection was made there, but they had no evidence and had not yet carried out an investigation. So on the say-so of this right-wing pressure group, they suspended him despite not having evidence that any kind of form of anti-Semitic speech had been engaged in by Funes in the classroom. And here too is the implication that any speech on Palestine will de facto be anti-Semitic. They're, again, sandwiching Jews and Zionists together, whether or not Jews are actually opposed to Zionism and Israel. Now, this kind of would be obvious, right? The right wing doesn't like diversity, equity, and inclusion. They believe that we should have a colorblind approach to race. Obviously, there's an underpinning of racism and anti-blackness and anti-Palestinianism within all of this. But much more concerning is actually how DEI is being used by university administrators to actually back the Zionist line. So you've got this discourse of anti-racism being used to present Zionists as an ethnic group in need of protection, just like any other racialized or ethnic group within, on a university campus. And university DEI policies are basically being instrumentalized in order to establish particular protections for Zionists. And again, you won't find them referring to these people as Zionists, but they will be referred to as Jewish students or Jewish staff in need of protection because of anti-Semitism. Again, you have this conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, you might again think that this is something recent that we've only seen over the last few years, but what's been made apparent with work by, for example, my colleague at the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, Meir Gelman, is the role played by organizations, particularly the Anti-Defamation League, that I'm sure everybody is familiar with, in actually bringing this about over many decades. So the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, overwhelmingly, this is a quote from her article, overwhelmingly backs expanding DEI programming to address rising anti-Semitism. Now, the ADL is often a go-to source. If you read a news article, particularly out of the US, you'll see that it's often referred to give stats and research on race and racism. But actually, from its early days, it was involved in repressing Black radical and Palestinian activists. For example, the ADL, and I quote, laid into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, for its, quote, pro-Arab, Soviet, and racist lines on the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is as early as 1969. And the ADL and other Israel-aligned groups played a significant role in using US anti-terrorism law to criminalize Palestinian activists and restrict aid to Palestine in a practice referred to as lawfare as early as the 1970s. Now, you might think that this is only happening in the United States, but if you take a look online at the Macquarie University Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Policy, it actually includes the definition of anti-Semitism that was formulated by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which actually cements its definition of anti-Semitism to criticism of Israel. So in the examples that the IHRA working definition provides of what constitutes anti-Semitism, an overwhelming number of the examples listed refer to any kind of criticism of Israel which would be constituted as anti-Semitic. And as you're probably aware, even the original drafter of the definition, Kenneth Stern, now says that he regrets how the IHRA definition has been utilized by institutions in order to repress any kind of, well, he doesn't actually go as far himself as saying to talk about repression of speech on Palestine, but he doesn't think that it has been well used. So if you look at the Macquarie University DEI policy, what you'll see is that anti-Semitism, again using the IHRA definition, is the only form of racism that the policy singles out. So you get kind of general reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't have any mention of Islamophobia, we don't have any mention of anti-Indigenous racism, we don't have any mention of any other kind of racism, only anti-Semitism. So therefore, it becomes an instrument to use when somebody is seen as having crossed the line with regards to anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is made equivalent to anti-Zionism. And this is what we have seen in recent weeks with the attacks on the scholar and writer Randa Abdel Fattah, who is currently experiencing attacks on her. She is an employee of Macquarie University. She's actually an ARC Future Fellow. Okay, so let me try to bring it to a close. I hope I haven't gone on for too long by talking about our local context here. So in early November, we formed a collective of staff and students here on campus, have formed a collective that we had called WSU for Palestine. In fact, Amani spoke at our opening rally in November, and Eileen chaired the rally. And we actually formed it in response to clamp down by the security on campus to students expressing solidarity with Palestine, including Palestinian students who themselves were directly affected by the beginning of the genocide in Palestine. We organized an open letter that I know many people here have signed. It's actually been signed by 430 plus people, and various other initiatives and events, and there are more to come. Now, in December, a delegation of us went to the Academic Senate meeting to present the open letter and listen to the response of the Vice Chancellor. And one of the things that my colleague Ben Etherington from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts said in his address was that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the university put out a strong statement and committed to not working together with Russian universities. And we asked him respectfully to inform us why he couldn't take a similar stance on Palestine. And his response was that these were incommensurate circumstances or incommensurate situations. He nonetheless, and this actually speaks to your point at the end about universities making statements and us putting pressure on universities to participate in the boycott and so on, he invited us to send him wording for a statement, but eventually, let's just say that didn't come to pass. And actually, I think it was as far back in November that the Black Studies scholar and poet Fred Moten, I listened to him on an interview, and he said, you know, we actually have to think twice about whether or not it's a good idea to be putting pressure on universities to write statements, because what does it mean for institutions that are so imbricated in colonial power to write statements? Can that actually be used by universities to then kind of whitewash their own collusion? So I thought that was a really good point, and we, as a collective, we kind of then dropped the idea of trying to get the university to do anything. But nonetheless, colleagues at the university have been very, taking lots of initiatives. One of the ones I wanted to signal to you was the Palestine Project, that's coordinated by one of our collective members, Suhair Edelbi, who's a lecturer in the law school. Now, it's actually in the context of this and in the aftermath of the Academic Senate meeting that we've noticed an uptick in the use of the language of safety with regard to senior management's, let's say, responses to our activism. And I revisited the transcript of the Vice Chancellor's webinar on March the 5th, during which I asked him a question about whether or not we would be protected in taking action on Palestine on campus. And he responded, and there's a long response that I can share with you, but one of the things that he said was that all speech and action must not incite hatred or violence, and that we must focus on the safety and security of staff and students. And taken together, I think these are very important and worrying words. I think we can see this in the wider context of the ways in which language about racial vilification or racial harassment is harnessed to argue that Zionist or pro-Israel positions should be protected speech. And this can only be achieved through, as I said earlier, cementing Jews and Zionists to each other so that they become interchangeable despite the obvious existence of anti-Zionist Jewish people. And what this has done, really worryingly, is it's allowed non-Jewish people, and it's really important to note that the overwhelming number of Zionists in the world are non-Jewish people, it's just a demographic, reality. It's allowed them to define who is and who is not really Jewish, thus allowing for anti-Zionist Jewish speech to be policed and sanctioned, the implication being that anybody who is anti-Zionist takes a position against Jews. Our response, though, I think, should not be to call for more safety on our side, and this might sound paradoxical, but just as DEI has been critiqued from the left as enabling a neoliberal co-optation of anti-racism and the dilution of the anti-racist call into things like unconscious bias and microaggressions, pitting one group's safety against another, I think is falling into a trap. Here, what you see is racism and colonialism being reduced, very much like what you spoke about, Amani, reduced to their traumatic effects alone for the individual and isolated from the violent structures that create them, including universities. And I think this is really interesting and concerning within the university's newfound commitment to indigenization and curricular decolonization, which I think, maybe controversially, is a largely defanged exercise which doesn't call into question the university's complicity in reproducing colonial violences at many levels. And this is not just an issue for our university, but for universities across the global north. So I just want to end by saying, what does this look like in practice? What does this kind of, colonial complicity look like in practice? Obviously, we know the university works with policing the carceral state through disciplines such as criminology and policing, but also through work on destructive mining projects and infrastructural projects, as well as its direct engagements with weapons manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin, University of Melbourne, but here at this university with Thales, Australia, Raytheon, and BAE Systems. In particular, and this is something that the collective is working on at the moment, WSU's International Center for Neuromorphic Systems, do not ask me what this is, has a relationship with Thales Australia. Thales, which is an international company but has its own subsidiary here, produces missiles in partnership with the state company Israeli Aerospace Industries, and it also produces drones with UAV Tactical Systems, which is a subsidiary of the Israeli military electronics company Elbit. So obviously none of this is safe when we think about the discourse of safety. So when safety is invoked, we should ask whether safety in fact means the safety to continue universities' collusion with racism, colonialism, and genocide under the cynical guise of protecting minorities. These questions, I think, are particularly important at our university, which is a university which trades on its commitment not only to multiculturalism and refugee rights, but to social justice in general. So I'll end it there, and I welcome any questions on the collective, on the Institute, or any other aspect of what I spoke about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for some questions, comments, observations. If you could use the microphone, that would be greatly appreciated.
So I'm in the silence.
I wanted to break this
Why
up.
not?
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I think we're all speechless because you were also incredibly articulate. My question, I guess, is I really love the way you all think about the connection between the personal, the interpersonal, and the structural. And I always think about this in terms of how we translate that into practicality, right? So you were talking before about some of the strategies you've taken to try and help people make those links. But I think all three of you were talking about that. How do we encourage people to understand those links and then act on them in really practical ways? That's just a real small question.
Let's try it.
Try.
Okay. I think you press down on the button. We haven't used that one before. It's on. It's on.
Okay. So for me, it's been a lot of storytelling. We have a term that we use called mindful disclosure or deliberate disclosure. So telling stories that may be quite traumatic, but telling them with purpose. And I think part of telling my story with purpose is making sure that I'm making connections to those broader structural things. And that equips other people to think about their own experiences and feel empowered to redirect the anger that they may feel about what they have experienced as an individual towards the systems that have affected them. It might be welfare policy, it might be refugee policy, migration policy, it might be any system. And a lot of the people that I talk to, a lot of victim survivors in the family violence space will share their story and share their sadness and their frustration. And a lot of that is really stuck with nowhere to go because they don't have the tools yet to hold something bigger than themselves accountable for the harm that they've experienced. And that goes beyond individual perpetrators of violence. That goes beyond what's achievable through the legal system. So for me, telling those stories, looking at people's experiences and finding those links, which is beginning to happen, I think, a bit more effectively, that's the key for me. And I do that through literature or through visual art or in my advocacy. I always try to tell stories that help illuminate gaps in our systems or actively oppressive structures that we live with.
Maybe I'd like to add, both Alana and I, as she said, were born in occupied Palestine. And I think positioning yourself as a Jew who is an anti-Zionist is powerful, even though we don't like to work as a Jew only, because we do it because we believe in what we're doing. I think it does make an impact, and we see it by participating in the rallies. People thank us or people talk to us because maybe they've never met an anti-Zionist Jew before. So I think positioning your story and your specifics in this instance as a Jew who opposes Israel and who considers herself to be anti-Zionist is a useful strategy. It's not a principle, but it's a strategy. Like the boycott is not a principle and a strategy. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think all of us can do a lot as university workers in the classroom, and I think a lot of pressure is put upon us to be careful and cautious and to not to speak about Palestine or other types of colonial violence and other types of issues that are considered to be controversial. But I actually think we have a lot of space to do that, and we should be taking up that space, because what I've been absolutely, it's always been obvious to me, but what's been made absolutely clear in the last 6 weeks of this semester, where we've spoken about Palestine on every single occasion in the classroom with the students, is that not only do they want to know, but they also they are engaged, they are reading, they are thinking about this, and they are teaching us. And I think that's what we can do, right? We just have to grow it like a seed, and then we become too multiplest for the powers that be to tell us that we need to be, we need to be silent, because globally we are in the majority, and morally we have the correct position, and they are on the wrong side of history. You can already see the deck chairs being moved around on the Titanic, and very soon, when Zionism will fall, everybody will be scrambling to have said that they were on the right side, just as all the Europeans, were suddenly members of the resistance after 1945.
One more question at the back, Rossiter.
I think I could possibly speak loud enough.
I can't hear it.
No, she can't hear you.
I can't hear it.
I appreciate that. My hearing is similarly.
We can hear you.
Well, look, thanks so much for a very powerful, moving, and very clear critique that you all made in the panel. And thank you, Juan, for your very thoughtful and careful introduction. I had a question that wasn't a matter of that was discussed amongst you, but sort of slightly maybe touched on at the beginning, Alana, of your talk. This is the question of the state. I was reading recently the really superb, I thought, a review by Alberto Toscano in New Left Review's Sidecar magazine, where he's reviewing a book by Haydar Iyad's book, Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind, which he speaks about in terms of a kind of false consciousness of the Palestinian assimilated intelligentsia and elites, and a kind of opium even of the Palestinian people with regard to the Oslo Accord and two-statism, the proposal for two states, which he sees as underscored by an inherent kind of violence and racism. So my question is, really, if you wouldn't mind, I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on the two-statism as against, a state, a single state, because we're certainly not hearing a critique of two-statism in the media more widely, and we're starting to hear, of course, by Penny Wong, for example, yesterday, of people coming behind the two-state proposal, and I was interested in your thoughts on critique, possibly.
Well, me, as an Israeli citizen, having enjoyed all the privileges of Israeli white supremacy, I don't think it's up to me to decide on a solution. However, I personally would not go with two-state solution. Palestine is tiny. Palestine and Israel are less than half of Tasmania, okay? With 14 million people living there at the moment. That includes Gaza, the occupied territory, and Israel, okay? There's no room for two states. Also, it's Palestine. And we are the colonizers. We have no right for this territory, okay? I'm not suggesting Jews should be eliminated or driven out. In fact, Palestinians have put forward the one-state solution where Jews, Muslims, and Christians will live together, as they have done before, both in Andalus, in Spain, and in Palestine itself prior to the Zionist movement. I think what we should all aim for at the moment is the end to the Zionist entity as Zionism, because Zionism is racism, it's colonialist. And then the solution will be led by the Palestinians, and we, anti-Zionist Jews, should be supporting them to find a solution together with those Jews who want to remain within Palestine, from the river to the sea, as we always shout in the rallies. But from the river to the sea is like 50 kilometers. It's a very, very tiny place. And I think we should strive to establish a new political entity, not based on racial supremacy, based on equality, one person, one vote, if people choose to maintain the nation state, which is in itself problematic, and strive for equality. But it's not up to us as Israeli Jews or former Israeli Jews to determine that. And I think it needs thinking, it needs talking, it needs deliberating. It's not simple, but it's possible if people are interested in justice and equality. That's the best I can offer.
The only thing I would add, thank you, is we've just talked about all the systems that are propped up by having this state in the world, including weapons manufacturing industries, the policies that are informed by the interests of a Zionist state, the way that the West is implicated in those policies and benefits from them as well in other colonized places. Having a two-state solution doesn't radically address or dismantle any of that. It allows it to continue in a way that might even be, and I think this is the thinking behind people like Penny Wong, etc., who are suddenly advocating for recognition of a Palestinian state. It makes it more sustainable in some ways, because we're then consenting to the status quo and further normalizing the nation state as the structure that then decides the fate of people. So for me, it's about really learning to imagine something beyond that, beyond as well the kinds of borders that we uphold here, beyond the kinds of systems that we're happy to sort of have in our societies, and just reimagining all of that. And I think as someone who is actually Lebanese and not Palestinian, we talk a lot about being able to drive from Beirut to Damascus to Jerusalem, and you don't have that if there are nation states that are policing borders as they have been.
I just wanted to add that I had a guest lecture from a young activist, a brilliant person, intellectual, Amal Nasser, in my class on Monday, and the video of her lecture is actually available on my website if anybody wants to watch it. But one of the things that she said, and it's really important, it connects to what we've been discussing, is that the reason why Penny Wong or any other Western leader would be advocating for a two-state solution is because they know that the implication of dismantling settler colonialism in Palestine, the implication of that is direct for us as a settler colonial entity in so-called Australia. And so this is about the alliance between the various settler states within an imperialist system for the preservation of Western civilization, which is a project that has to be looked at within a 500-year longue durée at least. And the threat that the global majority poses to the endurance of those systems is well known to those who benefit from the current status quo. And that's why there is such effort to create this pretense that somehow these two states partitioned, living side by side, would benefit Palestinians. It's a pretense in the same way that decolonizing the curriculum is a pretense around language that the Vice Chancellor used in a recent meeting, indigenous self-determination. I mean, it's actually incredible that that language, which rises from the roots, is being used to impose a system which, or a practice, or a set of practices, which, while obviously interesting and, you know, our students benefit from them and all the rest of it, does nothing to actually shift the balance of power within the settler colony and the colonial university. And that's why we always have to take this broader and deeper and historicized perspective on all of these questions and really be very precise about the links and the interests that need to be exposed for our understanding to be fair. And also, I mean, let's face it, this is a critical time at which everything is up in the air and everything could change. And we need to seize the moment, because we could be seeing, many people are saying, we could be seeing the end of Zionism in our lifetime. And we have to be brave.
Amani and Ronit, Alana, it's been a privilege to be able to sit here with you, to listen to you, to learn from you. It's an honor for the ICS to have hosted you today. I would like to invite you for lunch with us. We share a meal after the seminar, so hopefully you have the time, and invite everyone to follow up the conversations with you at the back. Thank Daniele Fulvi and the ICS Seminar Committee, and thank you all for coming, and I'm sorry to cut short. I am the colonial timekeeper today. That's the worst job. I hate that job, but it's time to go for lunch, so hopefully you can join us for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.